So welcome everybody. It's wonderful to see you all here. Thank you for coming. So I looked back into the emails between Geoffrey, Wolf, and I to see when it was. It feels like this talk has been a long time coming. And I discovered that it was about a year ago that we actually scheduled the exact date for the talk. And we picked it sort of strategically because it's the first week in October, and it was September 30th, or more accurately, October 1st, 53 years ago, that a chain of events unfolded that culminated in the mass killing of hundreds of thousands of Indonesians and the mass detentions of hundreds of thousands, maybe a million more. At the time that we chose that date, we didn't know that Indonesia would be occupying the news in the wake of the devastating tsunami in Palu in Sulawesi. Palu is a place like so many others in Indonesia that have been touched by this violent history, and it's a place that stands out in comparison to many others because there have been attempts there to face and address the events of 1965 and their aftermath. So today we're honored to welcome Professor Geoffrey Robinson from UCLA, who's discussing his recently published and stunning book, The Killing Season, A History of the Indonesian Massacres, which was published by Princeton University Press. Geoffrey Robinson is a professor of history at UCLA, where he teaches and writes about political violence, genocide, human rights, and mass incarceration. He has really spent decades researching 1965 and 66. He began his research on this topic as a graduate student at Cornell University in the early 1980s. Before this volume, his major works include The Dark Side of Paradise, Political Violence in Bali, published with Cornell University Press in 1995, East Timor 1999, Crimes Against Humanity, published in 2006, and If You Leave Us Here, We Will Die, How Genocide Was Stopped in East Timor, also Princeton University Press in 2010. Before he arrived at UCLA, where he's taught for 21 years, I think, he worked for 6 years at Amnesty International, where he was the head of Indonesia research in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And in 1999, he served as a political affairs officer with the United Nations in Dili in East Timor. So this meticulously researched book is really the first comprehensive history of the killings. And in it, Professor Robinson synthesizes his decades of research and knowledge on this period. An Indonesian translation of the book has just been published this week, which is historic and incredible, and hopefully the book won't be banned, and we'll see how it does. But it's a monumental achievement that happened. And in the book, well, the book exemplifies the kind of engaged scholarship that infuses all of his work, whether in the classroom, in his research, or outside of it. In it, he highlights the contributions of Indonesian researchers alongside Western ones, which is something that sets the book apart from other volumes. And the book, in the opinion of the view of this Indonesianist, honors the millions of Indonesians whose lives were forever transformed by the events that began unfolding 53 years ago. So please join me in welcoming Geoffrey Robinson.
Thank you, Martha, for that really warm introduction. It's funny, I don't usually get teary when people are introducing me, but your reference to the circumstances in which this book was written and the kinds of people who I thank and reference in the book really reminds me that this book is one, like so many on these kinds of subjects, which could not have been written solely on the basis of what one learns at a university library, but really did depend crucially on the contributions of Indonesian colleagues and friends, many of whom are not mentioned in the book because even today, 53 years later, it's too dangerous for them to be named. So thank you for that. Thank you, Wolf, for inviting me in the first place before the book was even published. You had confidence it would be published. And thank you, Isabella, for making arrangements. And thank you all for being here. Really honored. So, as Martha said, I'm going to speak today about one of the, what I say is one of the largest and swiftest, but most ignored instances of mass killing and mass incarceration in the 20th century. It happened in Indonesia starting 53 years ago. In a little over 6 months, from late 1965 till early 1966, roughly 500,000 members of the Indonesian Communist Party, the PKI, and other leftists were killed. Another million or so were detained without charge, and many were subjected to torture, including rape. The targets of this violence were ordinary people: farmers, teachers, artists, civil servants, and they were killed in gruesome ways: decapitated, castrated, their dismembered bodies often left in public places. This was not a civil war. Those killed and detained were not armed, and all belonged to what were at the time lawful political and social organizations. In fact, the Communist Party, the PKI, at that time was the largest non-governing communist party in the world, but it had no armed wing. The violence stemmed from official allegations that the PKI leadership had conspired to kill 6 senior army generals in a failed coup attempt on October 1st, 1965. Based on that unproven allegation, still unproven allegation, the army and its allies began a campaign to destroy the party, the Communist Party, and also to overthrow the country's popular left nationalist leader, President Sukarno, depicted here. In its scale and significance, the violence in Indonesia was comparable to some of the most notorious campaigns of mass killing in the post-war period, including those in Bosnia and Cambodia and Rwanda. And yet this violence remains virtually unknown and certainly unacknowledged outside of Indonesia. And so, for example, the World History Project website entry for the year 1965 includes the fact that Kellogg's Apple Jacks cereal first appeared that year, but fails to mention the killing of 500,000 Indonesians. Even inside the country, the events of 1965 and 66 are still poorly understood. The massive production of memoir, truth-telling, forensic investigation that have followed virtually every other mass killing or genocide in the past century have scarcely begun. Moreover, in contrast to most of the great mass killings of the 20th century, this violence in Indonesia has never been punished or even properly investigated. And to date, there have been no serious calls for any such investigation by any state or any international body. The book that I'm talking about today, The Killing Season, really sets out to interrupt that disturbing pattern of silence and impunity. It examines the events of 1965-66 with some very straightforward questions in mind. First, how and why this violence happened. Why so little has been said or done about it, and what the long-term ramifications have been for Indonesia. More specifically, it seeks answers to a number of analytical puzzles or problems about the violence that have remained elusive for these 50 years. First of all, what accounts for the distinctive geographical and temporal patterns and variations of the violence. That is to say, why was the violence concentrated in certain regions like Bali, East Java, Central Java, and Aceh, but not in other places? And why did it begin and end at markedly different times in different parts of the country? That's one analytical problem. The second one is, why, despite these variations across the country, did the violence take broadly similar forms everywhere it appeared? Why, for example, did these civilian militia groups everywhere play such a pivotal role? And why were methods like mutilation, castration, decapitation, sexual violence, torture, and mass execution, why were these methods so common across the country? And finally, who ultimately was responsible for the violence? How did they get away with it? And what can be done today to bring them to account? Now, the answers to these problems lie in part in Indonesia's distinctive culture, distinctive history, and political traditions. But I've actually found it more fruitful in writing this book and thinking about it to think about Indonesia's experience comparatively by contemplating the events of 1965-66 in light of the wider literatures on genocide, on mass killing, mass incarceration, and also the history of human rights. And so while I focus substantively on the case of Indonesia in the book, I also ask in the book some larger questions. Under what conditions are mass killing and mass incarceration most likely to occur? Why are some such serious crimes remembered and punished, and others simply forgotten and left unpunished? And finally, what are the political and social and ethical implications of such crimes and of such silence? I'll return to those broader questions at the end, but first I want to set out an account of the Indonesian violence that I think explains its distinctive patterns, the ones that I've described, but also makes possible some kind of comparison with other cases. So I hope that for those of you who are not especially interested in Indonesia, there will be some opportunity here to think comparatively about the lessons that Indonesia may bring. In the book, I explore three main dynamics that I think shaped the Indonesian violence. Very briefly, these are certain historical antecedents. Secondly, the pivotal role of the army leadership, the Indonesian army leadership. And thirdly, the decisive influence of powerful states. I want to talk briefly about each of these in turn. So my first claim is that certain historical conditions and antecedents related especially to political life made the mass violence of 1965-66 much more likely to happen, and also are crucial in understanding the dynamics of that violence. In making this argument, I don't mean to suggest that the mass violence of 65-66 was inevitable or was preordained, that history somehow drove inexorably toward this culmination. I'm simply saying that the particular characteristics of this violence were shaped, I think, by identifiable historical antecedents. And I think four of these were particularly important. The first was a colonial history that made bitter ideological differences between left and right a key fault line in Indonesian politics right up until 1965. By the 1920s, Indonesia's anti-colonial politics had begun to crystallize more along ideological lines rather than on the basis of ethnic or cultural identity. Within that political constellation, the left was especially strong, and the PKI, the Communist Party, was especially prominent. At the same time, the position of the left was repeatedly challenged by those who saw it as either antithetical to Islam, the religion of 85% of the population, or believed that it represented a threat to their economic and social status. Those lines of tension between left and right survived well into the post-independence period, the post-colonial period, and I argue laid the foundations for the deepening left-right conflicts that culminated in 1965. So the second historical condition that I point to was a process of state formation that gave rise to a politically powerful and conservative army. The modern Indonesian state took shape largely in the course of the country's wartime occupation by Japan from 1942 to 1945, and also in the 4-year fight for independence from the Dutch that took place from 1945 to 1949. The state that emerged in those years was underpinned by an army whose commitment to democracy and civilian rule was, let's just say, superficial. In the post-independence period, moreover, the army was able to secure political and economic power that it was reluctant to relinquish. And over this same period, the state itself became increasingly militarized. Both of these factors, the fact that there was a politically conservative and powerful army, and the fact that the state was becoming more and more militarized, I argue laid a crucial foundation for the state-sponsored violence of 1965-66. The third condition was the early development of an army doctrine and practice of mobilizing civilian militia forces, and also using unconventional methods. That's a polite term, as you'll describe, for something pretty awful. Using unconventional methods to combat domestic enemies. Influenced by the Japanese occupation forces, who many of its members trained with during the wartime occupation, and also influenced by the Dutch army forces against whom they fought in the fight for independence after 1945, the army adopted what it called a doctrine of total people's defense. Total people's defense, which essentially entailed mobilizing local people at the village level to fight domestic enemies. It also developed at this time what I call a distinctive institutional culture and a distinctive repertoire of violence. And that repertoire of violence included torture, mutilation, sexual violence, and mass execution. Those doctrines and practices that emerged during the fight for independence and during the Japanese occupation were the basis for the mobilization of the militia groups who detained and killed leftists after 1965, and also the basis for the particular forms of violence that they employed at that time. The final historical condition that I point to in the book was the emergence by the early 1960s of an extremely militant style of politics. Politics took place everywhere, on the street, all the time. This was not a place where politics only happened at election time. Indeed, there were no elections after 1957. That condition of a highly militant, highly mobilized politics was accelerated or accentuated by the polarizing logic of the Cold War, but also by the compelling but sometimes bellicose language of President Sukarno, an ardent anti-colonial nationalist and leftist. And it was, in addition, it was accentuated by the often obnoxious behavior of the United States and its allies in Indonesia and in Vietnam at this time. Taken together, these factors accentuated the existing left-right divisions in Indonesia and also fueled a growing sense of crisis from 1963, 64, up to 65. And in that cauldron, rumor, suspicion, and hostility flourished, providing a crucial backdrop to and stimulus for political violence. So my second general claim in the book is that the violence of 1965-66 cannot be properly understood without recognizing the role of the army in fomenting and organizing it. I don't mean that the army single-handedly carried out all the killings and detentions. That clearly was not the case. it had a lot of support from those militia groups and from political and social, conservative political and social and religious organizations that wanted to move against the left. What I am arguing is that, contrary to official Indonesian claims for the past 50 years, the resort to mass killing and mass detention was not the inevitable result of popular anger. It was not a spontaneous expression of deeply rooted religious and cultural passions. It was not a case, as Time magazine suggested, of a nation running amok. It was instead encouraged and organized by the army leadership itself, and in particular, this man, General Suharto, who went on to become the president until 1998, pictured here just days after the coup, moments before the violence began. The Army's decisive role had 5 crucial dimensions, probably more, but I'm only going to talk about 5. First of all, it developed and disseminated a discourse of existential threat to the nation. And that discourse provoked and valorized acts of violence against real and alleged leftists. So, for example, through a carefully crafted propaganda campaign, it demonized and it dehumanized members of the PKI and its many different affiliated organizations. For example, by portraying members of the leftist women's organization, Gerwani, as witches and whores, who they claimed, falsely, had castrated the 6 generals with razor blades. And then went on, the army and the army propaganda went on to call for them, in General Suharto's infamous words, to be, quote, destroyed down to the very roots. Indeed, those are the words that come from a speech he gave on the national radio the very night, on the very first day after the so-called attempted coup. In using this kind of language, destroying the PKI, destroying the counter-revolutionary forces to the very roots, the army gave license to the party's enemies to do the same, and provided, I argue, an essential ingredient in transforming underlying tensions, underlying conflicts, into widespread violence. I should drink this instead of holding it. Second, the army leadership quickly developed a broad plan to detain, transport, categorize, interrogate, and prosecute vast numbers of leftists. The army, as part of that plan, supplied or requisitioned critical logistical assets, such as weapons, trucks, detention centers, and hit lists. In the absence of such central planning, and without the Army's unique organizational reach, mass violence could not have extended to so many different parts of the country. Nor could it have been sustained for so long, and certainly it would not have entailed both mass killing and mass incarceration. Third, to carry out its plan, the Army leadership drew upon its historical experience and doctrines and practices, and mobilized an extensive network of civilian militia groups to do the essential groundwork of mass killing and incarceration. In the vast majority of cases, despite what has often been claimed by the Indonesian state, militia forces did not operate on their own. They operated with the full knowledge and usually under orders from army commanders. It was through these militia groups that long-standing religious, cultural, and socioeconomic tensions, which did exist, were transformed into mass violence. It didn't happen on its own. Moreover, the Central Army role in mobilizing and training these groups helps to explain, I believe, the remarkably similar repertoires of violence that were used across the country. For example, the disappearance, the sexual violence, the mutilation, the corpse display, and the mass executions. Fourthly, while the Army had the organizational and logistical capacity to implement a plan to destroy the left, it's important to note that its capacity to do these things was not unlimited. In some areas, in fact, like Bali, it faced resistance from local authorities. And because of that resistance, the plan was derailed or delayed. In Bali, as I mentioned, the governor and the regional military commander actually balked at the Central Army directives, and the result was a full 2-month delay in the onset of killings, despite the deep-seated, deeply rooted cultural and socioeconomic tensions. It was only when the governor and the military commander were removed and replaced by a governor and military commander in tune with the central command that the killing began. By contrast, the other end of the country, in Aceh, where the local civilian and military authorities were united in their support for the central command's plan, the violence began almost immediately, within a matter of days. And so what I'm arguing here then is that the army leadership's uneven capacity to mobilize local allies actually helps to explain both the geographical and the temporal variation in the pattern of violence. Finally, by virtue, and this is not finally the end of my talk, I'm sorry, it's kind of you'll have to bear with me, but just finally for this section. By virtue of seizing power and maintaining it for more than 3 decades, the army was free to write its own version of this history, while silencing alternative versions. There are not that many examples of this happening after a genocide or mass killing. There are some. The United States is one. It did this in various ways, including political show trials like this one. This is the foreign minister on trial, public rituals, education, and films that portrayed the PKI or members of the PKI as barbaric enemies of the nation. One of the most disturbing examples of that propaganda was the really pornographically violent film called, in English, Betrayal of the Indonesian Communist Party. That film demonized the PKI. It was a 4.5-hour film filled with blood and guts and horror. And it was unbelievably compulsory viewing for all school children from elementary through high school for 15 years until Suharto was forced from power in 1998. The result was a, first of all, profoundly misleading account, but also a deeply traumatizing account that proved crucial, that has proved crucial, I argue, in enforcing more than 50 years of silence. My third main claim in the book is that the actions of powerful foreign states were instrumental in encouraging the mass violence in 1965, and also in enforcing the long silence and impunity that has followed. Now, I am not suggesting that the United States or other foreign powers alone plotted the alleged October coup or the violence that followed, as some people have suggested. The evidence does not support that claim. Still, I think it can be shown, and I think I have shown, that in the absence of support from powerful states, notably the United States and the United Kingdom, but also its squeaky clean allies like Australia and Canada, and in a somewhat different international context, the mass killing and incarceration would not have happened. That claim is based on 4 main observations. First of all, the available evidence, and this is documentary evidence from the British, Canadian, American, Swedish, and other archives, shows unequivocally that in the days and weeks and months after the alleged coup of October 1st, 1965, the US and its allies actively encouraged the mounting violence. They did this in a number of ways. First of all, through a covert propaganda and psychological warfare campaign designed explicitly to, quote, blacken the name of the PKI and Sukarno in the eyes of the Indonesian Army and people. This is a quote from a foreign, it's a British document that is recommending already on the October 5th the initiation of a psychological warfare campaign to blacken the name of the PKI and Sukarno. Secondly, through the provision of economic and military assistance to the Indonesian Army leadership calibrated to increase as the Army demonstrated its commitment to crushing the PKI. The commitment of economic and military resources was grudging at first because the Americans and the British were unsure that the Army was prepared to move ahead strongly and forcefully against the PKI. Only when they were shown convincing evidence that they were prepared to go after the PKI did the promises of aid begin to flow more fully. And thirdly, in some ways most interestingly, they did this through a policy of strategic silence, coupled with secret expressions of support. Now this policy of strategic silence meant saying nothing, even as evidence grew and as they were fully aware, the documents show, of the nature and the extent of the violence. And so you see this quote, a kind of retrospective from the Department of State at a moment when it's quite clear what has happened. Until late March, our major policy on developments in Indonesia was silence. These kinds of interventions or silences provided vital assurance, in fact, a bright green light to Suharto and his allies that they could and should move ahead against the PKI without fear of repercussions. Secondly, the violence was crucially shaped by the broader international political context and particularly by the Cold War. As I've noted above, the Cold War context, dominated the domestic political scene, helping to create the highly polarized left-right division that was one precondition for the mass violence. But the Cold War was also essential in shaping Indonesia's international relations in the pre-1965 period, driving it ever closer to Mao's China, especially after 1963, and of course alienating it from the United States and other Western powers. It was Sukarno's drift to the left into the embrace of Mao, after all, that led the United States and its allies to support the Army leadership's move against the PKI, regardless of the cost in human lives. And it was almost certainly because the victims were communists or thought to be communists that there was then, and I would say still is today, so little sympathy for them in the West. Third, the violence was facilitated by the prevailing weakness at that time. This is my argument anyway, you can see if you buy it, but the prevailing weakness at the time of international human rights norms and institutions and networks. Perhaps most important was the near absence in 1965 of the transnational human rights and civil society networks, which starting in the late 1970s perhaps began to play such an important part in efforts to stop mass violence. In the absence of such networks, the United Nations took no notice of the violence. To my knowledge, it still has not said anything as a body about this violence. Most states, including Australia, as noted here, expressed satisfaction with the knocking off of 500,000 communists, or said nothing at all. And the mass media, for its part, largely parroted official views. And so in mid-1966, when the extent of the mass killing and mass incarceration was already well known, the prominent New York Times columnist James Reston referred to the events in Indonesia as, quote, a gleam of light in Asia. And finally, here's another one of these finallys, which isn't really the finally, sorry, still more. Over 50 years, powerful international actors have facilitated the Indonesian Army's work of rewriting the history of the violence. The US government and its former officials, including this man here, the ambassador, have gone to extraordinary lengths to hide or obfuscate the record that might reveal its own and the Army's complicity in the killing. Likewise, the US and its allies have to date not supported any process aimed at elucidating the truth or seeking justice for the victims of 1965. These conditions have meant that unlike the survivors of some genocides, many genocides, the survivors of 1965-66 have to date been unable to generate any serious world attention to these events in the half-century since they happened. To sum this part of my remarks up, the account that I presented here and elaborated in the book stresses historical antecedents, the critical role of Army leadership, and the influence of international actors and context in shaping both the mass violence and the long silence that followed. But I want to stress that in making these arguments, I do not mean to suggest that personal motives, cultural and religious tensions, and socioeconomic conflicts were unimportant in generating the violence. Clearly they were, as I elaborate at some length in the book. I'm simply saying that their significance was always shaped and circumscribed in decisive ways by the broader historical and political context. So this is the last of the slides that has to do with Indonesia, and so you're going to be treated to this vision of President Suharto and his wife and his child at a shooting range while I talk about the wider implications of the Indonesian case. Obviously, Indonesia's case is in some ways quite unique among instances of mass killing, but I think its experience may underscore and also help us to rethink some larger arguments about the dynamics of mass killing, incarceration, and impunity. So with that in mind, I just want to return to two of the bigger questions that I posed at the outset. One of the first of these, the first was, under what conditions are mass killing and incarceration most likely to occur? Okay, this is obviously a huge question, and there's a lot that could be said. So let me just isolate a few things that I think are noteworthy. Maybe the most important insight from the Indonesian case is that mass violence is not in any sense the natural or inevitable consequence of ancient cultural proclivities, deep-seated religious difference, or underlying socioeconomic conditions. It is rather the product of specific acts and omissions by people in positions of political and social and military power. In other words, as others have argued, Valentino and others have argued, underlying tensions, underlying conflicts and hatreds, no matter how deeply rooted they may be, do not lead automatically to mass violence. The turn to mass killing, the turn from conflict to mass killing and incarceration requires something more. Specifically, I argue it requires agents who articulate the idea that conflict can and should be resolved through violence, and institutions with both the inclination and the capacity to do that. The obvious candidates for that role, I argue, are armies, police forces, militia groups, and revolutionary movements, whose institutional norms and doctrines portray violence as legitimate and effective in achieving political ends, and who have the logistical and organizational wherewithal to carry it out. It is these institutions, I think, that serve as crucial vectors in translating enmity and conflict into mass violence, including genocide. How they do that, how they become those agents and translate enmity into violence, depends a great deal on their histories, as I've described for the case of Indonesia's army. Depends on their histories and on their internal institutional dynamics. Over time, what I'm arguing here is that these kinds of institutions develop what I call distinctive institutional cultures, which may be more or less violence. But also importantly, they develop what I call repertoires of violence, which are essentially patterned routines of violence that are learned by those who are associated with or part of the institution. Those cultures, those institutional cultures and repertoires, I think, help to account for certain distinctive patterns of violence that are otherwise quite difficult to explain. At the same time, the Indonesian case underscores the critical significance of regional and local conditions in the dynamic of mass violence. As Scott Strauss has observed, even where violence is centrally ordered, its implementation invariably depends on local and mid-level actors. If those actors are enthusiastic allies of a central command, with both the will and the capacity to carry out its directives, mass violence in all likelihood will be facilitated or accelerated. By contrast, where important local or mid-level actors are resistant to central directives, or where they lack the organizational and logistical capacity to carry them out, that violence is likely to be slowed. The point is that even in the most centralized and authoritarian political systems, such local and mid-level actors always have some measure of autonomy, and the exercise of that autonomy can help to account for important geographical and temporal variations in patterns of violence. That violence doesn't happen the same way everywhere, and part of our job as historians, I suppose, and social scientists is to try to explain that. To these largely domestic processes, the Indonesian case suggests a number of ways in which international actors and international context can contribute to or constrain genocide and mass violence. To put the matter rather simply, those things, genocide and mass violence, are facilitated by a range of international actions and omissions that strengthen perpetrators vis-a-vis their victims, including things like arms transfers, psychological warfare campaigns, military interventions, the provision of non-lethal aid, and crucially, strategic silence. Perhaps less obviously, the Indonesian case shows that genocide and mass violence can be facilitated by prevailing international norms. Norms that construe violence as legitimate in achieving certain political or moral ends. That category certainly includes utopian and revolutionary ideologies, as Weitz has argued. But the Indonesian example suggests that other widely accepted norms, including national security, law and order, development, may also be invoked in ways that facilitate or justify extreme violence by the state. And finally, the Indonesian case suggests that the often noted effects of war on genocide, the way in which war may facilitate genocide, for example, through brutalization, through discourses of treachery, through acute political polarization, and through mass mobilization, that these effects are actually not unique to wartime contexts. On the contrary, Indonesia's experience, after all this occurred not at a time of war, suggests that these effects can also emerge in times of intense yet largely nonviolent conflict over political ideas. The second general question I posed, and I will stop with just this question, was this: why are some serious crimes remembered and punished while others are forgotten and left unpunished? The most important insight from Indonesia, perhaps obvious, is simply that power matters. That is to say, as long as those responsible for the violence remain in power, the processes of truth-seeking, of reconciliation, justice, compensation, memorialization, and the rest of it are simply unlikely to happen. If we think of the places where those things have happened, almost invariably they're in places where the perpetrators have been thrown out. And the process of truth-seeking has happened sometime shortly afterwards. That was certainly not the case in Indonesia. Even after such a regime has been deposed, if it's been in power for so long, those processes of truth-seeking and reconciliation and memorialization are going to be difficult to set in motion. And that is especially so where the official version has become deeply entrenched in social memory, as happened in the case of Indonesia. It can be entrenched for a lot of different reasons, through sheer repetition, through traumatic experience, but also simply through fear and repression. That dynamic certainly helps to account for the Indonesian case, and it may also account for the record of silence and impunity in other instances as well. Certainly the United States and its genocide of California Indians is one example that comes to mind. Indonesia's experience also suggests that silence and inaction in the face of serious crimes stems from the particularities of the international context. So on the one hand, the experience gives some reason to believe that international human rights norms and robust civil society networks can sometimes serve to inhibit and even stop mass violence. On the other hand, the Indonesian example highlights the disappointing fact that the interests and the posture and often the indifference of powerful states are usually more decisive than norms and civil society networks. Still, and I'm getting close to the end here, Indonesia's recent experience makes clear that the power of states to control historical narrative, memory, and justice is never absolute, especially since the collapse of the Suharto regime in 1998. A remarkable group of domestic and international civil society actors, including artists and teachers and songwriters and videographers and journalists and publishers, survivors and human rights activists, have sought to challenge the official dubious version of the violence and also to demand justice. And they are making some remarkable progress. I don't want to blow my own horn here, but the fact that a publisher was brave enough to publish this book with all that it says about the army and so on in Indonesia on the anniversary of the coup that set this violence in motion is a sign that things are changing. But there's a reminder here that when it comes to truth and memory and to accountability and justice, the path forward requires action outside the purview of the state. That is in contrast to the classic notion of transitional justice in which a state takes the initiative to fix the problem. In cases like Indonesia's, the most promising avenue is more likely to be through civil society and precisely not through the state. All of this begs the question of what, if anything, scholars and citizens should do in a case like Indonesia, certainly in a return to Indonesia here. One answer is that we should do nothing, on the familiar grounds that it's better not to open old wounds, let bygones be bygones, or that we have no business as foreigners telling others how to deal with their histories, and especially that scholars should not be involved with the subjects they seek to study. At the risk of breaching all of these norms, I want to suggest that there are indeed things we can and should do. And this list is by no means exhaustive, but three things. First of all, I think that we should insist that our governments, and here I include myself as a Canadian, insisting to my government, to open their archives from this period immediately and without restriction. There can be no possible justification for maintaining secrecy of these archives 53 years later. Secondly, I think we should demand that our governments and relevant international bodies encourage all credible judicial proceedings against those deemed responsible for the crimes committed. Many of them are still alive. Some of them are running for office in the next presidential election. And finally, I believe we should do whatever we can, with or without our governments, through our scholarship, our teaching, our creative work, our direct political action, if that's your thing, to disrupt the terrible silence that has allowed these crimes to go unnoticed and unpunished for more than half a century. Thank you. I won't be taking any questions.
Too many. Do you want? Are you comfortable?
Yeah, as long as if you flag for me who the crazy people are in the room.
Myself.
I'm going to stand here because that's a very bright light. Go ahead, Captain.
This was a fascinating talk, and and this might just be my ignorance on the topic, but I'm curious why you chose to call it a massacre rather than a genocide, or maybe use Barbara Hart kind of popularized the term politicide.
It's a fair question, and I have to say I have had many opportunities to brew that decision. But anyway, the reason that I originally did not call this, as my publisher wanted me to call it, the Indonesian Genocide, a history, is that I actually wanted the book not to be a kind of is it or isn't it book. I think there are other scholars who are involved in that, is it a genocide or is it not? that to me was not the most interesting question. This then created a problem because I hadn't made the case that it was a genocide. Could I then be calling it a genocide in the title or anywhere else? And I decided it wasn't really very honest of me to do that unless I revamped the book and made the case that it was a genocide. That's a sort of a superficial answer. The deeper answer is that, as I'm sure most people here know, it's a very hotly contested term. And the question is there value, analytical value in my introducing the term genocide or not? And I guess my calculation was that even though I'm not opposed to anybody who wishes to call it a genocide, some of my colleagues call it a genocide, some of them insist it mustn't be, I didn't think that there was much analytical value in my naming it that. But I do think massacres is the wrong term. Having said so, sorry to the publisher, but I think it was really, we were searching for a word that wasn't genocide, and it was, mass killing and mass incarceration, which doesn't really trip off the tongue. I mean, Massacres is especially bad because if you look at the book, you'll see that 2 or 3 chapters are all about incarceration and their consequences, and it's about, it's about much more than Massacres. So it's a fair question. And as you can tell, because I've talked so much about it, I don't have a good answer. Yeah.
I actually have 2 questions.
Okay.
So I was wondering if you can elaborate more on why violence was so publicly displayed. And my second question was, if you can tell us more about those songwriters who challenge the dubious versions of violence today, because that's something that I'm really interested in.
Okay. Well, the public display is very interesting. I mean, my interpretation of this is that, as I said, it's something that became part of a kind of culture of the army and its militias. That you see these practices of public display of violence wherever the army was operating. So during the revolution, certainly, but also in conducting counterinsurgency in Aceh, where there was a rebel movement, in counterinsurgency campaigns in East Timor, and also against Muslim rebels in certain areas. These were the methods that were employed, so there's a consistency to it. I have to think that, and I think that the answer to the question, why, is that this was in order very deliberately to terrorize. So it's a performance to ensure that people know this is what happens to you if you're a communist. The slide that I showed briefly of the people being impaled on stakes and so on, what I left out of that quote because it was too long and would get too complicated, is the final part of the quote says that on those rafts with the corpses, the decapitated corpses floating down the river in East Java, they had placed a bamboo pole with the PKI flag flying on it. So it was obviously very much a performance to say, these are PKI, this is what happens to you. There are many more gruesome things that happen to people that I haven't talked about that you may or may not want to read about in the book, but I believe it's a kind of terror, state terror. But on the question of songwriting, so a couple of interesting things on song, but I think there are people here who also know about this area and who might want to contribute. But one of the interesting things that's happened is that not simply that people have been writing songs, but people have been excavating and resuscitating songs from the past. So there was one particular song that was often sung at PKI and Communist Party youth rallies and so on, which was actually just a beautiful ballad about a woman who was so poor that she had to gather weeds by the side of the road and sell it in the market for a penny a bunch. And it's a haunting and beautiful song. And it was written during the Japanese period. It was not anything against the Indonesian authorities. But because of its kind of empathy for the poor and so on, it became a kind of song that was very popular on the left. And after 1965, the army banned it, saying it was a communist song. So this song, Genjar Genjar, couldn't be sung for 30 or 40 years. But now, since 1998, you see that it is everywhere. anytime you go to a gathering of, kind of students or leftists or people who are trying to talk to restore an element of civility in Indonesian public life, there's always going to be someone singing Genjar Genjar. And if you go on YouTube and you just type in Genjar Genjar, you're going to see 50 different versions. There are hip-hop versions, and there are folk versions, and there are traditional Indonesian music versions. So there's this kind of fluorescence of retaking the song, and there are other songs like that. I don't know if others may have more than one.
Just as in addition, we had a conference, Music as Resistance to Genocide, and we actually played the song there.
Oh, did you? Yeah. There you go. I think you had your hand up at first. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you for the talk. I naturally, well, it's the first time that I've ever encountered this history, but I immediately had a question about the local, on the local level. When militias were engaging in violence and massacres or incarceration, on the local level, after the deceased were buried and gone, was there any issue of wealth confiscation, assets? Was there any examples of these socioeconomic issues where you have the perpetrator taking on
Absolutely,
confiscating the properties of the
huge problem, both for people killed and for people incarcerated. So people who were perhaps 1 million people were detained for some period of time. Some of them and few of them with any charge or trial. Some of them stayed in jail for 30 years, some for 3 months. But what happened to a great many people was that when they were taken away, their families fled, obviously, because they were frightened, and then their properties were seized. And so even when they came back and they were released, they had no property. And they also had a mark on their identity card. They were required to report every week or every day to the authorities. They couldn't work, they couldn't get a bank loan. There were all kinds there, and for a good 40 years, all kinds of impediments, both formal and informal, that made it impossible for people who had been falsely charged and never formally charged to live a normal life. So a lot of the property changed hands at that time. And this was true in the urban areas where people had houses and motor scooters and all kinds of things. But I think especially a big problem in the countryside. And it was a problem in places where the left had been particularly effective in implementing land reform. So one of the kind of driving sort of underlying forces here that I didn't talk too much about was that there was a national land reform law, but there was so much resistance from landlords and people on the right that it wasn't being implemented. So the PKI and its peasant league pushed it and said, this is the law. We've all agreed this is the law, we just have to implement it now. That was deeply resented, obviously, because it meant that redistribution of the land of wealthy landowners to poorer peasants. When those poor peasants were rounded up and killed or whatever, then guess who got their land back? So this is obviously a motivating element. And there was an overlay of a particular kind of status as landowner together with a particular political posture, of more right-wing, more conservative posture. I'll just give you one more example of this, that when I was working at Amnesty, I went to a village in Bali where we heard that this village was very upset because someone was taking their land away. And we thought, oh, okay, land rights case, we're going to go and solve this problem. So I went to the village and I sat down, and there was a big circle around, and I asked, so what's going on here? And they said, yeah, no, this is our land. How long have you had this land? And I was expecting, since our ancestors. They said, we had it since 1965. And it's ours because we were given it by the landowner in exchange for helping the army and the landowner kill the communists. And so we got it fair and square, and now they want it back, and it's not fair to us. So you get a sense of, this probably was happening, it's a research project that hasn't been undertaken. Yeah, and then
Hi, Jeff. Thank you so much for the talk. I'm really excited to read the book. Well, first a comment. Just thank you for the images. They're really helpful in kind of thinking about the massacres 1985 as a real spectacle, right? And how, in spite of, it's been 53 years, but yet we still have the specter of Suharto. And is that Tommy Suharto?
Yeah, I think that's Tommy. I'm not sure. I can't. This is
Yeah,
his
it
son
looks like
here.
him, but yeah. Who is now running for office.
Right.
So it's very much still in play, and the increasingly kind of conservative turn that the country has taken. But my question has to do with the last part of your talk, which talks about the international aspect, and I wanted to hear more. If you could talk a little bit more about the different maybe collaborations that have been particularly important or instrumental in helping change things on a more transnational, international.
So there are some that I think some people, maybe people don't know about this, but I think there are two things that stand out. One is obviously the films of Joshua Oppenheimer, The Act of Killing and The Look of Silence. For many people, that is maybe the only thing they know about 1965. They are remarkable films. I was talking with Martha earlier. We kind of agree that The Look of Silence is a much better film. So if you want to choose, the Act of Killing is very spectacular and kind of in your face and shocking and awful, and cinematographically it's kind of bold and so on. The Look of Silence is a better film. But more importantly, from your point of view, what happened in that film and in those films is a kind of transnational collaboration, because those films were not only a big critical success in the US and in Britain and in Europe, they were a huge success and kind of galvanizing force in Indonesia. They were shown in Indonesia, usually in small venues. Sometimes they were disrupted by militia groups, by anti-communists, and closed down. Sometimes they successfully held them. And it really was a profound experience for many, especially younger Indonesians who didn't have any idea that there was another version of this story. And people, you could see it in social media and in blogs and so on. People were furious that they hadn't known this. And they were also incredibly grateful, not only to Oppenheimer, but to the chief protagonist in his film, who was the son of somebody who was killed. The younger brother of someone who was killed, and who in the film is shown tracking down his killers and asking them in the most gentle and polite way what they thought they were doing. When he appeared in these screenings in Indonesia, and someone at the end said, "Oh, and by the way, the man in the film, Adi, is here," the whole place erupted, and he received 5 and 10 and 20-minute ovations. So these were very important films. Whatever you think of them, historians are quibbling with it. Indonesianists are all over it, saying, they got this wrong, he got that wrong. The point is that politically speaking, it has changed the dialogue in Indonesia, as my book will. No, my book will not. But the thing is that if anybody wants to make the movie version, what was the second part of your question? Oh, another one. The other thing is the International People's Tribunal. So there was, in the absence of any serious chance of a serious judicial process, either in Indonesia or abroad, a group of lawyers, human rights activists, both Indonesian and international, got together in 2015 and staged a people's tribunal, so an unofficial tribunal of the crimes of 1965. It was called the International People's Tribunal 1965. It was held in The Hague, and the justices came from all over the world, and they heard a lot of testimony and a lot of documents submitted. The result was a kind of a foregone conclusion, because it was the purpose was to bring together the evidence against the army. But the justices actually went beyond their original brief and concluded that this was in fact a genocide. And this again had a kind of galvanizing effect, not only internationally, I think more importantly internally. And it kind of has forced the government in a sense to permit some discussions that it wasn't permitting before. So those are two that come to mind. And then, yeah, sorry.
So this is totally new content to me. I'm a Rwanda specialist, so this is sort of like I'm learning, and so these might be naive questions.
Sure.
But I'm interested in why, for example, like your question about why are some things remembered and people are brought to justice, and you know, in the case of Rwanda, it was very public and international and so on and so forth, and why are others forgotten? And you know, Cambodia was also a Cold War conflict of communists, you know, like being targeted. It's like, why did Cambodia, where do you think Cambodia succeeded where Indonesia failed? Or like, what was the secret sauce that made the Cambodian tribunals go through many, many years after the fact? But and there was like the Khmer Rouge people stayed in power for many years afterwards too. So I feel like there's a lot of parallels, and so I was wondering if maybe you had insight into what's missing.
It's a good question. I mean, one thing that is different, I would say, is that in the case of Cambodia, the perpetrators were the communists. The communists were not the victims, right? So that's quite different. When the victims are communists, there is never expressed any sympathy for a communist. How can you be sympathetic to a communist? This is the sort of the mindset. Communists, they must, you know, they were probably going to seize power and kill us because look at what they did everywhere else. Therefore, how can you have sympathy for a communist? So that's different in the Cambodian case because the perpetrators were kind of arch communists of the worst kind. Even though the ones who came to power after 1979 were the remnants of the Khmer Rouge, they were actually quite a different group than the ones who had committed the genocide. So that's one important difference. The other big difference is that Cambodia was probably much more vulnerable to outside pressure than Indonesia is. Indonesia is, I mean, although nobody really knows about Indonesia, it's the fourth largest country in the world. It's actually incredibly important as a place for oil and natural gas and all kinds of things. Strategically important for the United States and China. It's not a place that we hear much about, but it is actually not a place that can be easily, it's not vulnerable. When Indonesia has been vulnerable 2 times in the past 50 years, important things have happened. In the late 1970s, it was vulnerable because of the oil crisis. It was in the late 1970s that there happened also to be a major international campaign to free the political prisoners that succeeded because Indonesia was vulnerable. That campaign was led by Amnesty International and the ICRC, the Red Cross, but it was supported under pressure from this international campaign by the United States. And Indonesia caved on it because it needed US investment and political support and economic assistance. The next time Indonesia was vulnerable was in 1999. And that was the moment when, and this was because of the financial crisis. In the context of the financial crisis, Suharto was forced to step down amid allegations of corruption and cronyism and so on. And at the same time, there was this referendum in East Timor that had been illegally occupied by Indonesia, where a genocide had been committed. And the pressure came from the UN and from various, kind of a lot of civil society groups for Indonesia to get out. And because of its vulnerability at that time, it caved again. And it permitted a referendum to take place, the UN referendum, and then it permitted the result of that referendum to result in East Timor's independence. So the answer then, the simple answer is that to the degree, the vulnerability of a state to outside pressure is going to affect the likelihood of its actually doing anything on the question of justice. And Cambodia is obviously a lot more vulnerable than Indonesia. Yeah, Jerry.
Thanks, Jeff. Question about silence in the Cold War. Sort of the relationship with the massacres and the communist world at the time. Do they seek to publicize this? Do they seek redress at the UN? Sort of use this politically in any way? So what's their sort of take on the massacres?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, what happened was that there was practically nothing from, in the way of international solidarity from the communist world. Partly this was because by about 1963, Sukarno had sided with China, and so had begun to have much less fraternal relations with the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union had, they had been telling Sukarno and the Communist Party, you guys are making a mistake in following Mao. You should be following us. And so when the PKI was caught out and was crushed, the attitude of the Soviets was, well, this is what you get for being adventurous. This is what you get for being, not following the correct line. So they said very little, and like the West and most others, they took them about 6 months to get right on board with the army to try to sell them arms and other things. The only countries that said anything of consequence, I mean, China was a bit of an exception, because among those who were targeted in the killings and the incarceration were ethnic Chinese, Indonesians. And so China did one thing they did was that they sent ships to various ports in Indonesia to evacuate any Chinese who wanted to flee. And they allowed them to come to China, and they provided for them for many years. So that was one. It wasn't an act of protest so much as an act of rescue. Eventually, and actually there was quite a large Indonesian exile community living in China. A couple of years later, Indonesia's relations with China were completely cut off, so there was not much that China could do. There were some protests, but it was really, they were on their own. China was not able to influence the UN, obviously. And so the UN really, as far as I know, I mean, it'd be interesting for somebody to do a quick research on this, but as far as I know, the UN never did or said anything on the subject. Yeah?
Thank you for your presentation. Going off of your comment, you mentioned how many ethnic Chinese Indonesians were targeted. Were there any other groups, or were there any other characteristics of the people that were persecuted that made them a target?
It's a really interesting, important question. One of the things that I stress in the book, and I think is really important, is that the single most important identifying characteristic for victims was not any ethnic or cultural or religious or racial group. It was one's politics. Chinese Indonesians were targeted to a considerable degree because of an assumption, and in some cases a reality, that they were sympathetic to the left. The reason they were sympathetic to the left was that the left, and the PKI in particular, had stood up for ethnic Chinese and insisted that they be permitted to have full citizenship and not be pushed around. And so not all ethnic Chinese were leftists. They weren't necessarily members of the Communist Party, but many of them joined a Chinese organization that was affiliated with, or very close to the PKI. So they were Chinese, yes, but the reason they were targeted was their politics. And likewise, if you look across the board, the vast majority of people who were killed and incarcerated were killed by people of the same ethnicity or religion. So Balinese Hindus were killed by other Balinese Hindus. Timorese or Floridinese Catholics were killed by other Catholics invoking Catholicism. Muslims were killed by Muslims invoking Islam. Protestants were killed by Protestants. People of the same ethnic, religious, and cultural group were killing one another on the basis of their political affiliation or presumed political affiliation.
So I think there's a lot of potential here to think comparatively with other genocides, and it also stimulates my Indonesianist brain to think comparatively about Indonesian violence, state violence. And the repertoires of violence kind of frame is a useful tool in that. As someone who knows so much about East Timor as well, can you talk a little bit about what you see as the relation between, some people have argued that 65 was a kind of training ground that taught the state that it could get away with murder that it then carried out in East Timor, but your presentation already is kind of broadening that, that lens. So could you talk a little bit about
Yeah.
how you see the relation between these two events?
I think they're closely related, and not mainly for that first reason you mentioned. I don't think it's mainly because they realized they could get away with it. That's part of the story. But I think a more important part is that this is the regime that came to power through this kind of grotesque display of force, and that used a particular style, a particular repertoire of violence, in their view, very effectively. It was the same man, Suharto, who seized power and came to power in the wake of this violence, who organized the violence, who also organized the invasion of East Timor in 1975, just 10 years later. And the methods that were used were pretty much identical. One of the first things they did was to organize militia groups, civilian militia groups in every village. And so that within a few years they had probably 50, 60,000 militias in an island which is like half the size of Rhode Island. And so, and in addition to the use of militias, they also used the same kind of performative techniques or repertoires. So there was decapitation, there was sexual violence, there was dismemberment, there was mass execution. So, I mean, to me, it was partly because of my observation of these things happening in East Timor, and then looking back and seeing the same things happening in '65, and in fact also looking over to Aceh in the late 1980s, where exactly the same militia forces are developed and the same kind of performances or the same repertoire is developed, that it made me think about this idea of this being an institutional problem, and that the institution as being a kind of vector through which these kinds of behaviors are not exactly passed on through a command, but through institutional learning. So a battalion that it comes from, that has a certain experience in East Timor, then is deployed to Aceh. It brings with it a style of operating, a set of ideas about what is effective, and what's acceptable. And so I think, one of the problems that historians sometimes have is that they're obsessed with the written word, and there's an awful lot that you can find in the documentary record about what's going on. But what I don't think you'll ever find is a document that says, cut their heads off, impale them on stakes, cut off their genitals. You won't find it, because those are part of an institutional culture that don't need to be commanded, and that's how they travel. So I guess I see that. I don't know if that really answers your question, but that's how I see it as in fact being something that continues. Indeed, it has continued after Suharto fell, because institutions don't just stop, right? They have a certain inertia, and the Indonesian Army is a perfect example of that. Yeah.
Yeah, picking up on this a little bit. I mean, first of all, I thought this was really incredible, kind of in your capability of synthesizing, these all these details of a book into this short talk. But what I found really, and you mentioned Scott Strauss, I think there is a lot of work done on these kind of regional differences. And now you just kind of emphasized the institutional kind of learning. But when you think about these regional differences, the institution is in all these regions. So it can be only one part of the explanation, that there is kind of these learned rituals of violence. Because there are other factors in play. And a little bit different, I think, is also when you talk about 65 and 66, and then you go to East Timor, because the goals and the kind of the target group, there is a difference to 65.
Yeah.
So other factors are in play. Can you elaborate a little bit
Yeah.
on the other factors?
Sure. I mean, you're absolutely right. It is somewhat complicated to try to take that book and pack it into 35 minutes, so I left a few details out. But these local conditions are actually quite important. But before I say what they are, I just want to, add one little thing there to what your articulation of the argument, and that is that in addition to the sort of institutional learned behaviors and so on, the thing that I was arguing is that these local and mid-level actors, the army commanders and so on, their posture, their position, their attitude is actually one of the critical things. You have differences among regional army commanders. Some of them are with the president. The president is saying, stop this violence, it's terrible, it's tearing the country apart. And some commanders say, I follow Sukarno, I'm not going to do this violence. And others say, to hell with you, we're with the right wing of the army. So there are some of the local difference doesn't have to do with culture and socioeconomics and religion. It has to do with simply the posture and the politics of important actors who control forces in any given area. But having said that, there are big differences. So in socioeconomic and cultural and religious terms. So for example, the worst hit areas were Central Java, East Java, Bali, by far. What do they share? They're highly populated, densely populated places, and they're places where the PKI was very strong and very aggressive, I would say, in implementing land reform. So that these are places where land reform was an issue, and where the PKI was strong enough to push it. So there's an important kind of underlying factor that gives people on the ground a motivation to join the militia group, that gives a landlord a motivation to provide the weapons and surrender his house to the army as an incarceration center and so on. So there is something happening there. The other thing that happens that I try to discuss a little bit in the book is that overlaying or reinforcing those kind of socioeconomic tensions, both the landed and the landless, and the fight over land, are certain kinds of cultural categories. Those with a lot of land, the big landowners, tended also to belong to conservative Islamic political parties of a more conventional kind. Those who were landless tended to be nominally Muslim, probably real serious Muslims, but of a different kind, who also integrated their Islamic into their Islamic beliefs. They integrated certain pre-Islamic practices, and who were regarded as insufficiently Islamic, both because of those practices, those kind of syncretistic practices, and because they had opted to join the Communist Party. So there's an overlay of politics and culture and socioeconomics that is mutually reinforcing. And so in that context, when someone comes along and says, guess what, we're giving guns to people who want to go and kill the communists, you've already got a whole set of things that are there. Yeah, they took our land, they're atheists, they're not true believers, of course rumors were also circulated that communists share out everybody's wife, that they don't believe in marriage, and all these kinds of things that get stirred up, and they tend to reinforce and provide a kind of very lively and volatile foundation for the army to mobilize. Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned the three dynamics, the historical antecedents.
Yeah.
How significant was the particular form of Dutch colonialism and the Dutch, the course of the Independence War? Did this have any particular impact on these extreme forms?
Yeah, I mean, I'll restrict my comments just to the Independence War, because if I start talking about Dutch colonialism, I'll go on forever.
Mm-hmm.
But let's just say that the Independence War actually was important in at least two really big ways. One was that in the context of that war, as was actually not uncommon in the region, there were different elements of the independence movement who had different political objectives. There were more conservative ones who wanted simple independence, but there were also those on the left who wanted a kind of revolutionary society, not just independence. And so there was conflict among nationalists or people seeking independence. In the case of Indonesia in particular, those came to a head in September 1948, when a small kind of rebellion by leftists, communists, was portrayed as an act of sabotage against the nation and was crushed by the Indonesian Army itself. So there was that kind of internecine war that kind of highlighted and accentuated a sense of this left-right division right in the very cauldron and the very moment that Indonesia was becoming. And that was remembered. It was remembered by the left as the moment that they would be cut down by the army, and it was remembered by the army as the moment when they had been betrayed. And it came back in 1965. As soon as 65 happened, they said, we knew we should never have allowed the Communist Party to come back after 1948. They've always been treacherous. And so that was one thing, the particular way in which the left-right conflict played out within the context of the revolution. And the second one was, as finally Dutch historians are starting to acknowledge, the Dutch behaved appallingly in that war. They behaved unbelievably badly. And the tragedy, and so many of the things that the Indonesian Army did after 1945, they learned not just from the Japanese, but from the Dutch. Collective punishment, torching of villages, mass executions, rape, beheading, all of these things were part of, I alluded to it very much in passing, but these were learned from the Japanese and the Dutch. The Dutch, for years, until just a couple of years ago, insisted that there were kind of some certain aberrations and a few bad apples and so on. But now there has been much more systematic research showing just how widespread this bad behavior was. And the tragedy, of course, is that Indonesians who were the victims of these things then appropriated the techniques. So how do you learn about torture? You learn about it in part by being tortured. You learn all the methods of torture because you experience it. And then you use it against your enemies. And that's, I think, what the Indonesians did. Yeah.
Sorry, but just to follow up on your what you just said, in South of Latin America, we can trace some training of the perpetrators, made sometimes by the CIA, sometimes by lost soldiers, French soldiers, of lost colonial war. Can we find this similar training, given by outside freelance or more or less freelance military professionals?
It's a little complicated in the case of Indonesia because in the lead up to 65, half of the armed forces were getting their training and their equipment from the Soviet Union, and the other half was getting it from the United States. Now, significantly, the Army, which was the most conservative and which took the lead in the killing, was supplied by the United States and the British. And the Navy and Air Force, who were somewhat took a back seat in this, and in fact were themselves attacked in some cases, were supplied by the Soviets. There's not a lot, and some of those Army people did study in the United States. They came to various for a year or 6 months to study counterinsurgency and various techniques. It hasn't been really well studied though, but certainly there's connections, and the links in particular. I highlight some of them in the book, that there are links between the particular group of Army officers who were behind the campaign against the left, and certain rather well-known characters in the U.S. Military establishment. And they had maintained relations in spite of the deteriorating relationship between the U.S. and Indonesia. They had maintained these relations, in particular through the mechanism of the, what is it called? Civic action. So civic action was it was portrayed, was introduced under Kennedy as a kind of way for the Army to help folks out in the countryside, build irrigation canals and so on. But it was actually very, very effective way. It was an aspect of counterinsurgency. And it was through these civic action campaigns and civic action funding that certain ideas about how to combat communism were introduced into the army. So that's an area that could do it a lot more.
We don't know if they were on the ground. Some U.S. We have the question about Rwanda.
Yes.
French soldiers in Rwanda.
Yeah,
We don't
as
know.
far as I know, I mean, there was by 1965 there was very limited U.S. presence. They had been pulling back, but as for training and ideas and suggestions about how to behave, that certainly had been going on. But there's another research project for somebody else.
I think. Any more questions?
I have a question. How many languages you translate the book?
Oh, how many languages? Well, so far, Indonesian, and there's one coming out in French. Are you offering?
Just curious.
Yeah, there's one will come out in French soon, and who knows how many others. Yes.
So, so we will need to talk about Rwanda and a little bit of Rwanda and genocide. And what period of time, how long did this mobilization of these
Yeah, okay, so it's interesting, is that some of these groups actually had been mobilized well before 65, and then they were kind of weaponized in 65. So they had, a lot of, in this very volatile political situation, a lot of political parties and religious groups had a youth wing. And they, they would march around and they played drum bands, and it was very, it was becoming militarized, really. But then what happened in 65 is that the military went in and said, you young boys from this party and this party and this party, we need you. Here's a weapon, here's a truck, here's a bag of rice, here's a list of the people in your village, go and get them. So the mobilization of the youth groups and also a slightly more formalized self-defense troops within the context of the village had been going on really since the early 50s. So that it was well established. And it just remained in 65 for them to kind of turn them and give them direction and say, well, now instead of walking around playing drum bands, we'd like you to go out and round these people out, and we'll help you. What's fascinating about this is that the Army seems to have known and calculated that it would be to their disadvantage to appear too close to the front of the action. And so in their own internal memoranda, which they shared with the Americans, they say, well, we let the militia groups go out front and we stay behind. And so, but they're there with their trucks and the backup and so on, providing all the organizational and logistical wherewithal and the kind of backbone if the militias don't do what they're supposed to do. And then, of course, they get closed down because they're no longer useful. Once you've rounded up all the communists, you don't want a bunch of armed youth. So you take their weapons back and you tell them to be quiet. Okay.
Yeah, I think we have to thank you. This was really great.